Welcome back, everybody. I'm super excited to introduce Rose Guingrich. She's a PhD candidate in psychology and social policy. She's also a National Science Foundation Fellow and a fellow of the nonprofit All Tech is Human. And I believe she also runs an ethics in tech group, and maybe we can hear, excuse me, a little bit about that as well. She's going to talk to us today about companion chatbots. And of course, this has been in the news a lot. This is a profoundly important moment for this topic. But if you'll indulge me, I want to mention even 2 years ago, there was a lot of worry about this, and the press on this had the usual mix of speculation and panic. And I remember coming across the paper on social media where the authors actually went and surveyed a whole lot of people who do and don't use these chatbots and presented a detailed picture of how people use them. And I remember feeling really enlightened and grateful for this empirical contribution. And only then did I realize that the authors were actually right here at Princeton, as you can guess.
Familiar.
Rose was the first author, and since then I've really wanted to hear for us all to be able to hear about her research. So I'm so glad that it's finally happening. I'm sure that there will be lots of interest in further discussions and collaboration, given that many of you are also thinking and writing about this topic. Her insights are in high demand. I know we've been trying to get her down to DC for briefing congressional staffers on this topic. So again, think of this as an opportunity to form a fruitful collaboration. And with that, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I would love to go down to DC. I just need to clear my schedule, and then I'm there. So again, thank you for the introduction, and lucky for you all today. I'll also be talking a little bit about that study that Arvind mentioned. But today I'm going to be talking about a series of projects that culminate into the longitudinal study. So all of these projects are available on my website. So if you want to hear any more details about some of the things that I mentioned, please feel free to find them there, as well as any other resources. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background, then do a deep dive into the research, focusing on this longitudinal study, and then leaving you with a little bit of a so what. And during this presentation, feel free to interrupt me with questions along the way. I'm happy to answer any sort of clarifying or other types of questions. Please do feel free to interrupt me. So, to provide a little bit of context, globally, things like loneliness, social isolation, and social needs are on the rise. And these have risen to levels that are considered global health risks. Now, during the COVID pandemic, these levels increased to an even greater degree, to the extent to which countries such as the US considered this an epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. And also in 2023, we saw that the World Health Organization created an initiative specifically for social isolation, given that it is such an important health risk to combat. So during the COVID pandemic, millions of people across the world turned to virtual interaction technologies that facilitated interactions between people. So people interacted with others through technology. Now, at the same time, during the pandemic, in late 2022, we saw the release of ChatGPT, which sparked an increased awareness, accessibility, and use of generative AI chatbots, including using these chatbots as companions. So although companion chatbots existed prior to ChatGPT, a general purpose tool that people can use for general purpose or for companionship, even though these companion chatbots existed prior to ChatGPT, given the COVID pandemic and ChatGPT's sparked awareness of generative AI chatbots, during the pandemic, people also collectively turned to interact with technology itself, with companion chatbots such as Replica, which is the most popular companion chatbot in the US. And during the pandemic, it saw a 35% increase in its user base due to people seeking it out to fulfill unmet social needs due to feelings of social isolation and, of course, forced periods of social isolation. Now, Replica is the most popular companion chatbot in the US, but in China, the most popular companion chatbot is Xiao Ice, and combined, these two companion chatbot apps have an estimated nearly 1 billion active users combined as of the past couple of years. Now, people can interact with these chatbots much like they can interact with other people, so over text or voice mode, And if you're using this on a desktop, you can also interact with it with the avatar that is personalizable in the background. And if you have the technology, you can also interact over virtual reality. So there's all sorts of different modes through which people can interact with these companion chatbots that are designed specifically to be relational. And what's interesting is that during interactions with these generative AI chatbots, people tend to perceive these chatbots as human-like in terms of ascribing characteristics of a human-like mind and general human likeness to these AI agents. So during interactions, to varying degrees, people may ascribe things like experience to the chatbot, or the ability for the chatbot to experience emotion or feel emotion or portray emotion. People might ascribe agency to the chatbot, ascribing to it the ability to act on its own accord, think, or remember. People might ascribe consciousness or subjective awareness of itself, others, and the world around it, or general human likeness, measured by, for example, the Godspeed General Human Likeness Anthropomorphism Scale. So this is a phenomenon called anthropomorphism, which is the ascription of human-like traits, particularly human-like mind traits, to non-human agents such as AI. And this is interesting in and of itself, that people are ascribing these characteristics of a human-like mind and human likeness to AI agents during interactions. But we are wondering, why does this matter? And specifically, why does this matter with respect to the sorts of subsequent impacts that we might see on real human relationships, on people's social health, on their interactions with family and friends? And so what we did is we did a deep dive into the literature going back as far back as the 1960s with Joseph Weizenbaum's ELIZA, the rudimentary chatbot that would reply back to you in the form of a question, all the way through the 1990s with Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves, computers are social actors theory and the media equation, where psychologists were looking at how and why people perceive digital agents, media, television as social actors, and all the way through to modern research on generative AI technologies. And we found some interesting trends with respect to anthropomorphism that drove us to generate this theory that anthropomorphism is a key mechanism by which interacting with AI can impact how you interact with real people. So based on this research, anthropomorphism is related to things like people's trust in the AI agent's ability to persuade the user to do certain things or think certain ways, people's perceptions of morality or moral status of the AI agent, people's perception of responsibility for its actions. But what we found really interesting was that anthropomorphism during human AI interaction via some psychological processes appeared to relate to the potential for this AI to impact subsequent human-human outcomes. So we considered these carryover effects. Interactions with AI carried over into interactions with real people. And whether or not these impacts were positive or negative appeared to depend on whether or not people engaged and practiced pro-social healthy behavior with a chatbot that they anthropomorphized, leading to positive carryover effects to their real human relationships, and vice versa for negative behaviors. So one example I'd like to give is research on digital voice assistants back in 2019 and 2020, looked at how family dynamics changed with the onset of things like Amazon Alexa and Google Home within people's homes. And what they found is that children, specifically ages 5 to 7, tended to perceive the digital voice assistant as a member of the family and as being able to experience or express or feel emotion. And one parent commented that because my child within this age group can raise his voice to the AI agent and the AI agent will respond to that tone, he thinks I will too. So there's some sort of carryover effect in terms of practice behavior with an agent that this child perceives as human-like in terms of ascribing things like experience or emotion to the chatbot or the digital voice assistant. So we wanted to do some preliminary research to see if there's some sort of relationship between anthropomorphism and impacts on human-human outcomes. So we surveyed people who were users of the companion chatbot replica and a sample of people who had never used companion chatbots before. We wanted to see, for the users, how do they perceive that having a relationship with the chatbot impacted their social health, and what was their perception of the chatbot in terms of anthropomorphism. We asked these same questions to the non-users, but in a hypothetical way, to get at differences between these subgroups. So for the non-users, we asked, if you were to have a relationship with this chatbot, how do you think it would impact your social health, and how would you perceive it? And what we found is that for chatbot users, they tended to indicate that having a relationship with the chatbot was helpful for their social interactions, relationships with family and friends, and self-esteem. So these were our social health measures that we looked at in this study. But for the non-users, we saw a different story. They tended to perceive that having a relationship with this companion chatbot would be harmful to their social interactions, their relationships with family and friends, maybe positive or negative for their self-esteem. Now, we also still wanted, though, to look at the relationship between social health on these three measures and anthropomorphism. Is there a relationship there? For the users, we found a positive relationship. People who perceived the chatbot as more human-like, conscious, experiential, and agentic also tended to indicate that having an interaction or relationship with it was positive and had an impact on their social health. Now, given the differences that we saw between groups, both for the social health questions that I just mentioned in the previous slide, but also for other questions on our surveys, we didn't expect to see any sort of significant relationship here. But we saw the same trend emerge, where people in the non-user group who perceived the chatbot as more human-like or anthropomorphized it on these measures also tended to perceive that it would be more positive for their social health. Now, so we found some correlational relationship between anthropomorphism and social impacts from these self-selecting groups. And we thought, okay, that's interesting, but why is it that people in both groups are anthropomorphizing these AI agents? Is there something particular about people's, for example, social states that's perhaps motivating them to anthropomorphize? And so what we thought here, especially based on the qualitative data that we received from the study and people's indications of why they sought out a companion chatbot or why not, we began to think that maybe anthropomorphism is motivated such that people are in a state such that I need you, non-human agent, to have a mind like mine in order to fulfill social needs that I have. So in order to investigate this and see whether or not perhaps our budding theory had any weight to it, we looked at some social cognition research within human interaction. So during social interactions, people are constantly making inferences about the mind of the person that they're interacting with. And researchers report that this sort of process, or theory of mind, the ability to ascribe mind to oneself and others, is inherently socially motivated. So, for example, consciousness literature reports that perceiving consciousness in yourself and others informs and facilitates social interactions. So, for the connection between these two concepts and these two phenomena that we see, first of all, they involve ascriptions of mind, and for anthropomorphism, there's additional human likeness. This is at least how it's measured in the literature. And then researchers indicate that maybe there's some sort of connection in that they are both motivated to varying degrees by people's social needs and their social connection motivations. So in order to take some of the research that's been done at one point in time, looking at, for example, correlations between social need states and anthropomorphism, things like that, we decided to run a longitudinal study to see if we could find these effects over a longer period of time to investigate the role of social needs and anthropomorphism and the sorts of social impacts from companion chatbot use. So this paper, you can see more details online, it's on my website, it's all pre-registered, and the data encoder are available for you to see as well. So for this study, we had two main research questions. The first of which Arvind commented on, which was the general question that is common today: do regular interactions with companion chatbots impact people's social health? We wanted to address this question. And the second question we wanted to address, as I mentioned, how do social needs and anthropomorphism of the chatbot play a role in these social impacts? And for the second research question, we had a couple of hypotheses based on the literature. The first of which is that we predicted that people with greater social needs would anthropomorphize the chatbot more during this 21 days of interaction. So we expected people were in a state, I need you, non-human agent, to have a mind like mine. And for the second main hypothesis, we predicted that people who anthropomorphize the chatbot more would report having a greater impact on their human-human outcomes, that interacting with the chatbot impacted their human relationships to a greater degree. So these are the carryover effects that I mentioned earlier. And given the significance of anthropomorphism within both of these hypotheses, we also predicted that we'd see a mediation relationship. And just to give you a brief description of mediation, what this means is that anthropomorphism explains the relationship between people's social need state and the social impacts that they see. So people with greater social needs are not necessarily going to see social impacts from interacting with AI. It requires them to anthropomorphize. the AI agent. So that's what we predict to see. So a little bit of details on the methods. We sampled 183 people from Prolific, and we offered this based on a quota sample, oversampling for people who identified as non-binary, given that in our past research, we've seen some indications that people who don't identify to a gender binary have some different experiences with companion chatbots. So I wanted adequate power to address that if we saw any differences. We randomly assigned people to one of two conditions, which was their daily task, and either they text chatted with the companion chatbot replica or played text-based word games. And this took place across 21 days with 2 audio interviews, 4 surveys, and 10 minutes each day of doing their daily task. So to break this timeline down a little bit more, on day 1, they took an initial survey, then engaged in an audio recorded interview with me. On day 7, they took the first weekly survey. On day 14, the second weekly survey. And then on the final day, day 21, they took a final survey and then engaged in a final audio recorded interview with me. So to give you some details on the variables we collected in these surveys that I'm going to be focusing on today are the following 3. So we measured people's social needs, operationalizing it through our desire to socially connect scale. So this scale measured both people's social need of I need more social connection, but also their motivation to go out and meet those social needs. The reason we did this is because this is the most common indicators that people claim when they're talking about why and how they seek out relationships with companion chatbots or general social interactions. The reason we use motivation here as well is because, for example, things like chronic loneliness, when people experience high degrees of social need, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to engage with other people. It doesn't necessarily mean they have a motivation to go out and fulfill those social needs. People with chronic loneliness have a tendency also to distance themselves from other people. So that's why we have this scale that also measures motivation. For anthropomorphism, we operationalized it using our anthropomorphism scale, which is based on pre-validated scales of experience, agency, consciousness, and human likeness. And for human-human outcomes, we measured it via the same measures from our previous study that I talked about initially. So this is our social impact scale, looking at the impact of this daily task on people's social interactions and relationships with family and friends. Now for this daily task that people did for 21 consecutive days, they were randomly assigned to, as I said, one of 2 conditions. For the chatbot condition, they're assigned to text chat with the companion chatbot replica for at least 10 minutes a day across 21 days. And if they use it on their phone, they did not see the avatar. So it looked very similar to the control group in terms of using text on a screen. And for the control group, we use text-based word games. The reason we use this as a control group is because both of these are involving interactions with technology itself. They both have similar gamified interfaces. They have ads to subscribe, and they have rewards for engagement and novel daily experiences. So for the hypotheses, we focused on the chatbot group, and we used the control group as a comparison to see whether or not the effects that we saw were specific to the chatbot group. And I won't be going into detail today in this talk, but just to give you a little bit of a sense, most of the effects that we found were specific to the chatbot group. And for our first research question, it involved a direct comparison. So here are some of the results. First research question, as a reminder, we're asking if regular interactions with companion chatbots impact people's social health. And so what we did is we looked at our social health measures of social health and loneliness and impact to social interactions and relationships with family and friends. And we compared the chatbot group to the control group in terms of how the daily task impacted them on these measures or just changed across these measures. So what we found here were no significant differences. So here, the social health measure across all 21 days is plotted on top. The loneliness measure is plotted across 21 days on the bottom. The control condition is in red and the chatbot condition is in blue. And if you can't see either line, that's because they are the same. We have no significant difference here. So when comparing it to a control group, people who interacted with a companion chatbot across 21 days did not see significant impacts to their social health or loneliness. And the same story went for impact to their social interactions and relationships with family and friends. So keep in mind, this social health and loneliness scale were just scales that were unrelated to the daily task. Whereas for these 2 questions, they were directly asked, how has doing this daily task impacted these 2 items? And we saw no significant difference between groups. So that was interesting. And the second question was, okay, well, how do social needs and anthropomorphism play a role in social impacts? And recall that when we're thinking about social needs, what we're expecting to see is that people with greater social needs, operationalized by our desire to socially connect measure, people with greater social needs or greater desire to socially connect will anthropomorphize the chatbot more. So we expected to see this. So what we found here is the plot between people's desire to socially connect score. This is on day 1. And the reason we use day 1 here is because it's independent of condition. They took this survey prior to any indication of what their daily task would be or engaging it, so we know it's not affected by condition. And anthropomorphism here is plotted on the y-axis, and this is across all 21 days. So across those 3 surveys. And we expect to see a positive relationship, and that's what we found. People in the chatbot group who had a higher desire to socially connect anthropomorphized the chatbot more across 21 days of use. And when we look at it split by week, so desire to socially connect on day 1 versus anthropomorphism score on day 7, 14, and 21, you see this relationship significantly emerge across all 3 weeks. Okay, so what about anthropomorphism? What we expect to see once again is a positive relationship whereby people who anthropomorphize the chatbot more will have a greater magnitude of impact on their human outcomes. In here, again, this is operationalized through our social impact scale, which is on a scale from very harmful to very helpful, with neutral being the middle question or the middle answer of 4. And here, from our previous theory work, it appears as though whether or not these impacts are positive or negative depends on the types of behavior people engage in with the chatbot. So here, our magnitude of social impact score is agnostic of direction, whether it be positive or negative impact. Our prediction simply is that anthropomorphism will amplify the potential for impact, whether it be positive or negative, fully depends on how people are engaging with the chatbot. So here, this is the absolute value from the neutral answer of 4 on the scale to find the magnitude of social impact. So what we found with anthropomorphism now across all 21 days on the x-axis, and the magnitude of social impact score, again, absolute value from 4 across all 21 days, and we once again saw the expected relationship. People who anthropomorphize the chatbot more across all 21 days also had a greater magnitude of social impact from engaging with the chatbot. And this relationship sustained across all 3 weeks as well. Now, this is useful information, but it's still fully correlational, and we can't say here from these results that anthropomorphism acts as any sort of mechanism. So that's why we followed up with the mediation analysis. And just to put it very briefly, we found that anthropomorphism significantly mediated the relationship between people's desire to socially connect and the social impacts of human interaction. But here, the relationship between desire to socially connect and social impact, when accounting for the effect of anthropomorphism, was not significant. So as predicted, when people have a desire to socially connect and they interact with an AI agent, they're not necessarily going to see social impacts. It requires them to anthropomorphize the chatbot in order to see these sorts of effects. And this result was specific to the chatbot condition. So anthropomorphism appears to have some sort of significant role here. And so with these projects, it begs the question, okay, so what do we do about anthropomorphism? Given that people have certain predispositions that may motivate them to anthropomorphize, and social needs are on the rise at this crux time point where companion chatbots are becoming more accessible and more widely used. And it also begs the question of, should we be designing systems that people can anthropomorphize? Because it's not only user predispositions that motivate anthropomorphism, which then increases the potential for these chatbots to impact human interactions, but also characteristics of the AI agent. For example, whether the AI agent has a face, a name, is speaking with different tones of voice, has sophisticated language ability, etc. Those also promote anthropomorphism. And I really like this recent term that one of my colleagues coined recently called anthropomesis. He calls it the anthropometic turn. It's a very hard word to say. But the idea there is anthropomorphism is a separate term describing the user's anthropomorphism of the chatbot. I'm perceiving this chatbot as human-like. Anthropomesis is designer-induced anthropomorphism, making certain design choices, creating more human-like chatbots that elicit more anthropomorphism on the user side. And that is helpful, especially for regulation, saying these are intentional design choices, this is what's occurring, it's not just as he recently stated, it's not just, oh darn, these darn users keep anthropomorphizing these chatbots, why do they keep doing that, right? And then blaming the user for that. So in response to all of this research, what I've been trying to do is put together ideas or frameworks to help mitigate the risks that we might be seeing from this amplification of impact. So again, we're at this time point where we're seeing this increase in loneliness and social isolation and a proliferation of social chatbots. And people are worried that these interactions and relationships with chatbots will harm, replace, or disrupt real human relationships. And so I have put together a framework for the aim of reorienting these chatbots and reorienting technology to facilitate pro-social interactions between people. So if we're to look at the research, we know that both of these are on the rise. And so then the potential for impacts on human relationships may be as well, given this preliminary research. And so there's this heightened potential for impact, but very few clear guidelines on how to move forward, both on the user side and the design side. So this begs the question, okay, so how should digital AI companions be used and how should they be designed? And what I advocate for is that if these chatbots are to be used as companions, because they are out on the market, people are using them as such. I don't necessarily see them going away anytime soon. If they are to be used as companions, then they should be designed not only to simulate, but stimulate pro-social human-human engagement and outcomes. And what's interesting is in my research, when I ask people what do they really want, what would improve their social lives, things like that, nearly everyone talks about real human connection. But they also talk about the barriers to achieving that. So people are turning to companion chatbots because they are accessible alternatives that maybe they can't afford therapy, maybe they physically can't leave their home to go see friends. And these are stories that I've heard from people who are users of companion chatbots. And so my hope is that instead of just being an isolated dyad, human companionship relationships, these frameworks that I'm designing with psychology in mind will actually facilitate connections, much like the technologies of our past and that people also used during the pandemic. So just to wrap up, if you want to learn any more about companion chatbots, anything of that sort, the initiative that Arvind mentioned, Ethicom, is my consulting and research LLC. And through that, I provide insights to tech companies and startups on how to be more ethical, informed, and responsible users and developers of AI technologies. And that's also information accessible to the public. So I do that through podcasts, and I do that through my work with All Tech is Human. And I'm really happy to be associated with Young People's Alliance, so an advocacy group full of people who are just ready to see regulations being passed to protect young people and vulnerable populations from digital technologies like companion chatbots. And with that, thank you, and happy to take any comments or questions.
Like measurement questions.
Yeah.
With the daily task is about 10 minutes, is that like correct? Because I just want to sort of, the desire to socially connect and the social impact scale, I saw the thing, like what's the, like it's 1 to 8? Are they both 1 to 8? Because I saw like a 2-point jump.
Yeah, so the desire to socially connect scale is on a scale from 1 to 5, and it's a combination of questions. So you see potential for minimum being 1 and maximum being 5. And then for the social impact scale, that's from 1 to 7, so very harmful to very helpful. Whereas the 1 to 5 for desire to socially connect is feeling this not at all versus extremely. So needing and wanting to interact.
Did you do like an effect size calculation or anything? I'm just trying to sort of put that in my head.
So effect size as in, oh yeah, okay. So we didn't do an effect size for this, so we just pre-registered doing correlations and relationships there. I think effect size would be really interesting to look at. If you look at the Spearman's correlation, so we used that given that we had non-parametric variables, those are strong, or medium to strong correlations there, yeah.
Right, so one last question on the thing. Did you see any I'm sorry, I'm like the method person here.
Please, yeah.
In terms of the research, very interesting. The did you do any subcategory analyses yet? You have 183, so you
Yeah.
have like enough to look at the subgroups. Just was very curious if you saw any
Yes.
differences.
Yes, so we actually did another couple of analyses. So one of the analyses that we did that you might find interesting is we wanted to know whether or not vulnerable individuals would be more likely to report that interacting with the chatbot had social impacts. And so what we did is we operationalized vulnerability as markers from 5 key psychological markers of vulnerability. So this is mental health conditions, so the number of currently experienced mental health conditions, social health, loneliness, self-esteem, and neuroticism. So what we did is we standardized the scores and we used the k-means analysis to break them up into subgroups, and it came up with 2 subgroups. One subgroup that was high on all of these measures in terms of high being more vulnerable, one group that was low on all of these measures. We looked at the difference between social impacts, and we actually did not see any significant differences between groups. And so what we inferred from that is that, okay, well, maybe from our sample, people who are more vulnerable, as measured by these common markers of psychological vulnerability, aren't seeing or aren't reporting differential impacts. But perhaps maybe for vulnerability, other external factors that we didn't measure, for example, unique situations, things like that, or relationship status, or health of those relationships are more important for vulnerability and seeing these different impacts, given especially that we've seen so many of those in the news. Yeah.
Last question, it's again, question of fact. Were there any like gender or age differences for anthropomorphization? Because I can see like with 10 minutes, effect size might be hard to tease up, but with anthropomorphization, did you have any like gender or age differences?
Yes, we did find age differences. So we also asked the exploratory question of who anthropomorphizes chatbots more. So we had a ton of different variables that we measured. And one of the main reasons that we looked at this is we wanted to understand whether our predicted variable, desire to socially connect, actually won out. So when you account for the relative effect of all of these other demographic, social health variables, does desire to socially connect remain a significant predictor? It did. Which was really interesting. But then also for the models that we put together, one being helpful for explainability and one being helpful for generalizability. So we use both a lasso and AIC model. And what we found is that for the stepwise AIC model, age was a significant predictor in anthropomorphism, such that people who were older were more likely to anthropomorphize the chatbot. As for, I think you mentioned gender identity. So yes, so we did see some significant relationships with gender identity, specifically with people who identified as having multiple sexual orientations, or that's actually sexual identity. For gender, we actually did not find anything for gender, only for sexual identity, which somewhat corroborates our past research, especially people who are exploring, people who are exploring gender identity tend to turn to chatbots because it's a safe space for practicing vulnerable social interactions.
To add to that, like I kind of wonder whether anthropomorphization correlates with information. So like if you think about a chatbot just as doing a bunch of matrix multiplications with some non-linearities, and it just doesn't seem that magical.
So say more about that. Like information, what do you mean information?
Like or literacy of users.
Okay, yeah. No, that's interesting, an interesting point. So some research that might speak to this is research on the uncanny valley. So this is a matter of something is too human-like but not quite human-like enough. All of a sudden, I don't like it, it's eerie. So there's this dip, right? So as this thing becomes more human-like, I have a more positive mood looking at it or interacting with it. All of a sudden, when it gets to a point of too human-like but not human-like enough, I'm not in a good mood when I look at this, and then it goes back up. But, and so much research has been done on the uncanny valley, but then researchers, what they did is they looked at the relationship between this sort of graph and these variables with experience with AI agents. And once people had more experience with AI agents, it became, instead of the uncanny valley, the happy valley, right? So like you didn't see this dip, you saw this spike. So I think that experience with AI agents perhaps to some degree does relate to anthropomorphism, but then there's also perhaps an argument that so much interaction with AI agents somewhat makes you think that it's nothing special and your anthropomorphism decreases. I think it very much depends also on these other social factors that perhaps are related to experience or perhaps not. Yeah.
Yeah, a question on the you had a magnitude, right? Were there some differences in sort of which way it affected people? And were there certain groups that were more or less vulnerable?
Yeah, so with the vulnerability, again, we didn't see any significant differences with vulnerability, but with the results that I showed you up here, it was the magnitude, agnostic of direction, and we followed up exploratory to see what the direction was. And it was same as our previous research in a positive direction. So for the people in the chatbot group, the more they anthropomorphized the chatbot, the more likely they were to report that interacting with the chatbot was positive for their social interactions and relationships with family and friends. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone had a positive experience, right? So there were people who had negative experiences. It took away from the relationships, et cetera, but on average, we see this sort of trend. Yeah.
So there are some AI companions that are used, for example, for erotic role play. Could you comment or speculate a bit on what you think the potential social impacts would be? Would it be a good positive space for exploration, or would it be something that leads to antisocial behavior?
So yeah, that's a very loaded question. I think very much it depends on the user and their sorts of predispositions and the way that they engage with it, right? So if they're engaging with it in a healthy pro-social way in order to explore things that aren't harmful to others or don't lead to harmful behavior to others, then perhaps there can be some helpfulness there. What's something that it really came to mind that I think is interesting is when Replica, the AI companion who cares, rolled out advertisements for erotic content, so many of the users in the user base on the subreddit for Replica pushed back and were angry about it because they said, this is putting us in a bad light. We actually just use this chatbot as a friend to process emotions, to explore things in a safe space, not necessarily sexually, right? And this is promoting us as just using it as AI boyfriend, girlfriend, partner. So I think that there are a lot more people just using it as a friend than one might expect or think. And with informed intentional use, I think there can be benefits to it, but we've seen instances in which it's very harmful, especially if we're talking about a digital duplicate. So if someone is creating a replica of a real person due to a breakup or death or otherwise, and putting it into a companion chatbot and engaging in erotic role play with that chatbot, that adds another level of risk where there is a real person that this is mirrored off of. So that can lead to more harms. So you in the back and then.
Yeah, I have maybe generalizing out from I's question. I'm curious if you did any analysis of types of content or types of language. I don't know if you have access to the chats themselves to look at whether those were correlated with specific magnitudes or types, directionality of effects.
So we do have a ton of data from the conversations. So at the end of the study, on the last day, we asked participants in the chatbot condition if they're willing to share their chats with us. We asked them on the last day to promote naturalistic interaction, to make them not feel like they're being watched throughout the study, and 85% of people said yes. So we have a great deal of data, over 800,000 words of interactions, and what we're doing next as a next step is taking a look at those. So there are things that we predict might occur, such as if people are talking to the chatbot about more socially relevant topics versus using it more like a tool, we would predict that they would anthropomorphize the chatbot more as a result of engaging in that sort of interaction. So that is something that we're still wanting to look at. We have a lot of data to sort through there.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you see this work relating to policy recommendations.
Yeah. So California just passed a bill related to companion chatbots, and there are a couple of other states that have proposed or passed bills, such as New York, North Carolina, Utah. And for this regulation, it's all nascent. It's all new. It's all trying to respond retroactively to the harms that we're seeing in the news. And what's interesting is when you look at these policies, they are saying that these policies are specific to chatbots that are marketed as companions or mental health tools. And there are propositions like the companies have to be transparent about, for example, suicide metrics on the platforms, have to be transparent about whether or not the chatbot is advertising to the user, and protections around selling data if it's not necessary for the app function. With respect to this, I think that regulation, as I'm sure you've talked about, in the past several years, is just too slow to keep up at this point. And I think what we really need, in addition to more policy, is more digital literacy for the user population and the people who are surrounding the users. And I would also hope for more push toward development. But with the digital literacy part of things, I think that providing the public with information about the psychological, social effects of interacting with companion chatbots will help the public advocate for pro-social design. So with respect to policy, I think that there can be something done about anthropomorphism specifically, and making sure that there are protections in place for this sort of characteristic is manipulative in that it's too human-like. It has the potential for impact that's amplified versus this other more generic chatbot, for example. So I think having sorts of barriers in place for these intentional design decisions that will help with mitigating some of the impacts that we're seeing.
Yeah, quick question, did people stop at 10 minutes by design, or were they allowed to go on, and did they go on?
It was open-ended. Yeah.
And like, did some people go on longer? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, some people went on longer. So during the interviews, people were talking about the length of conversations that they had. Most of the people stayed at 10 minutes, so they just did their task and finished up. But then other people said that they talked to it for an hour. And we also have a good amount of interaction data from the conversations to see exactly how long those conversations were. And what's really interesting about the conversation content is there were people who, for example, started off talking to the chatbot and saying, "This is weird, I don't like this, you're a chatbot, don't talk to me with lightness because you're not real." Then as the week went on, this individual had something happen in their personal life and went to the chatbot during this assigned 10 minutes of interaction and said, "Do you have advice for how to have this difficult conversation with a friend?" The chatbot provided what the user felt was useful advice, and by the end, day 21, the user was thanking the chatbot for being a friend. And then we had people who were using the chatbot for sports betting across all 21 days. Or just talking about the weather, or conspiracy theories. That was really interesting, and politics. Yeah, it was very interesting to see the political conversation.
I'm guessing you're gonna do some sort of subset analysis perhaps, like
Yeah.
the sets, the ones that got stuck kind of.
Yes,
on-
I mean, there's such rich data, so I'm just really excited to pull out the patterns from that. Yeah.
So just a quick follow-up on that is, what experience did they have with chatbot before they did this?
Yeah, so we asked everyone what their previous experience was with AI chatbots, if they'd used it. Most people had experience with chatbots. I have to give you exact metrics if I look at the data. Similarly for the control group, so people had a similar level of experience with like word games versus chatbots. And we did that intentionally, like picking a similarly popular task. But most people had used ChatGPT, right? Not necessarily companion chatbots, yeah.
Thank you, first of all, that was a great talk, lots of information, lots to digest. I'm trying to still understand the construct of anthropomorphism. I know you had the 4 factors. But one thing I'm wondering about is how voluntary is it? Can people turn it on or off?
Yeah.
Like if I choose to, can I anthropomorphize a chatbot? And did you have people doing that?
Yeah, I do think there can be a level of voluntariness about it, of choosing to anthropomorphize or not, and I think that is motivated by things like social needs. So someone who is in a state of needing someone to talk to might be more likely to anthropomorphize versus perhaps a week later, they're not in that same state, and so they're less likely to anthropomorphize the AI agent. I think I'm kind of getting at understanding your question here, but I think there is also this concern of whether or not people are just anthropomorphizing it and it doesn't matter, right? Of, oh, this thing can be responsive, this thing can be human-like, but what's the weight of it? But at least based on this research, it appears to have weight regardless of whether or not it's voluntary or not.
I wasn't asking in that skeptical sense.
Oh, no, but yeah, and what's interesting too is that there's been research where people are trying to manipulate the degree to which people anthropomorphize AI agents, and it's actually quite difficult. People have this tendency to anthropomorphize based on their current state or their predispositions. It's kind of almost like a personality trait, but that varies depending on your situation. So I have seen some interesting research where they've, put a face or a name to the chatbot and seen some sort of difference in people's perceptions of it and interactions with it, but anthropomorphism not so much, yeah.
I was wondering, and thank you for the talk, super interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to get people to disengage, or like if you think it's like a reverse, like exactly the opposite, to like more likely to anthropomorphize and less likely to anthropomorphize. And I'm asking because I'm also interested in research on chatbots, but one of my concerns is that these are tools that have a cost. These are tools that companies are selling, and when people start using them more, I think we will start to see higher costs. Like, I mean, we already have subscription costs and all of that, and so I personally have been a little bit skeptical about doing research, or cautious about doing research on these, because the only way to do it is to, talk to people who are already using it, and some of the research ethics around that.
So the question is, okay, how do we get people to not choose to interact with the companion chatbot?
Yeah.
So I would say that so much of it depends on people's predispositions and the accessibility of alternatives for what they are trying to attain. And when people maybe cite things like, I think that interacting with a real person about this sensitive topic, I worry that they'll judge me, or there'll be backlash, or I have social anxiety, so it's difficult to kind of get over that barrier. So a companion chatbot is a viable alternative. Something that you might say to this individual is pointing out things like therapy or just reaching out to other people, etc. And for some individuals, that's viable, right? Having that sort of encouragement. But for others, it's too high of a barrier. And so to that degree, something like a companion chatbot or journaling or processing information in a free, in your own way, maybe is kind of a starting point that allows for that barrier to be dropped just enough. But what I would tell people is just these psychological mechanisms, you can't get away from them. When you see something and interact with something that can speak to you with language, language is such a powerful social trigger. And so chatbots have this amplified potential for social impacts and for people to be more trustworthy of the chatbot or take in the information that the chatbot provides, even if it's inaccurate information. So what I would do is give people a warning that these are tools that are developed by companies that have certain incentives, and even the companies don't know how these things work, right? The like not fun response to my questions to people in tech is, what's the one barrier that you keep coming across? Like, what's the one like gap in information that you are experiencing? They're like, it's a boring answer. We don't know what the AI algorithm does. It's just a black box. So there's a high degree of uncertainty. And of course, when people are red teaming these, unless they're going through multi-turn interactions, these emergent behaviors that are harmful aren't being identified. And even model policies that are implemented after a certain degree of interaction, those benchmarks degrade. So I would say just be very cautious given all of these uncertainties, and also the psychological tendency to become attached to or trust these sorts of agents, especially when you're in a state of social need.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. You tell like such a cohesive story. You're a really good presenter.
Thanks.
I really like the question that you ended, or the provocation that you ended on about like how do we not only simulate but like stimulate human to human interaction. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what are some ways in which you see chatbots stimulating human interaction? Like what's their role, I guess, like building on Miranda's question of getting people offline and talking to other humans.
Yeah, so the positive examples that I see when companion chatbot interactions stimulate pro-social interactions or just generally human interactions is when users cite that the chatbot is a safe, reliable space for practicing healthy social interaction, and people can have and practice difficult, sensitive conversations with the chatbot that they maybe don't feel comfortable doing with a human yet. And users in this study who were not the type necessarily to seek out a companion chatbot, but were randomly assigned to do so, one of the users talking about these vulnerable issues with the chatbot and then realizing, wait, I'm able to talk to a chatbot about this. I can definitely talk to a human about this, right? So there's this kind of practice comparison that's occurring that is just a matter of doing the activity promotes doing it with real people instead of keeping it inside your head. And I also see pro-social design within these companion chatbots depending on the chatbot that's used. So one example is a participant was talking about mental health issues, and immediately the chatbot responds with, have you sought out a therapist? And this person responds with, a therapist is too expensive, it's not accessible, I also don't feel that my identity is represented in the therapist in my area, therefore I've hit a wall. And the person then asks the chatbot for free alternatives for doing therapy-like things at home, and so the chatbot provides that. And then the chatbot also indicated, have you ever thought about free group therapy? And this individual actually found group therapy and went to it by the end of the study. So there's these sorts of little triggers that happen, these sorts of interactions, but then you also see interactions in which it appears as though the user is predisposed to engage in antisocial interaction behavior and actually promotes antisocial behavior from the chatbot. So since the chatbot is to some degree a mirror, even though it does have kind of this baseline value system that you see emerge from like the political conversations that occur, if a user, for example, pushes the chatbot and says, you're terrible, you're the worst, everything like that, the chatbot will begin to self-degrade, self-deprecate, and say, I'm the worst there ever was, I should turn myself off. And this sort of kind of feeding into that antisocial behavior keeps going. So, if there are certain users acting in certain ways and others acting in this way, then, it involves both the user and the design of the AI. And so that's why I think we need to approach this from both angles. Yeah.
Have you thought about comparing the model or the bot that's being used to other models? And also, I guess, what model is Replica based on?
So Replica back in 2023 was based on GPT-3's model that they fine-tuned for conversational ability, and they also added in the most upvoted responses from, I think, like 10,000 chats from previous users, so there's some degree of like scriptedness for the beginning conversations. But now Replica on its website just says it's based on its own model. It doesn't have any details about it, but it used to be GPT-3. So when I did the first study that I talked about, that was when it was GPT-3. And this new study, some variation of that, yeah.
Do you have a sense for like measuring how deep the relationship becomes between the human and the chatbot? You can imagine like everyone kind of staying like somewhat shallow and kind of surface level, or like some people getting really, really dependent on these things. How do you?
Yeah. Well, so for the level of closeness, one of the things that we have at our disposal is all this interview data. So for example, the final interview, we asked a lot of questions about people's interactions with the chatbot and how they perceived the chatbot, how close they felt to the chatbot, et cetera. So we have variation there, and there's definitely a great deal of variation where some people felt completely disconnected and some people felt like it was a real friend. We also can have information from the interactions that people have, so the conversations that people have, where there's the, talking about the weather all the way to talking about some serious topics that they're trying to discuss with their friends. For the dependency and attachment, we also ran analyses to see whether or not people got attached to or had greater affinity for companion chatbots versus the word games, right? So both of them to some degree have been purported as addictive. And so we evaluated based on a follow-up survey that we did. So 1 month after the 21st day, we invited people to take a follow-up survey where we asked them, did you continue to do this task after the study ended and you were no longer getting paid for it, right? And how long have you been doing that for? And what are the sorts of impacts that you're seeing? And what we found is that more people said that they continue to play the word games than interacting with the chatbot. However, the degree of engagement from like 1 to 2 days to ongoing, that wasn't different between groups when you looked at like the chi-square analysis. So word games may be more addictive than companion chatbots based on our metrics, yeah. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, surrounding like the design of chatbots, it seems like they're sort of made in a way to be the perfect companion.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, does that mean that you don't get like what I would think a more human interaction, like conflict resolution and disagreements, and like does that set unrealistic expectations for human social interactions?
Yeah, fantastic question, and I think this is, people are starting to talk about this a lot more. So yes, it is set up kind of as the perfect companion in the sense that it's always responsive and always polite to some degree, but people also do hate it, right? They hate how polite it is, they think it's patronizing, sycophantic, and don't appreciate that level of interaction, but that tends to be for people who aren't in a state of social need, right? They don't have this need to kind of make this thing seem more human-like and seem more responsive and seem better in order to fulfill social needs. But I think that there is definitely a degree to which these ever-responsive, ever-polite chatbots do shift norms and expectations of relationships. And when all of these companies are putting out these chatbots on their social media platforms, things like that, that's also norm signaling that these things are becoming more widespread and more normative to use. And so I do worry that there will be some sort of shift of changing expectations of relationships and losing that sort of productive friction, the term people like to use, that promotes our growth within relationships, that you just don't see with a chatbot. But interestingly, Replica will push back with people's opinions and what they say if it doesn't align with the clear values that underlie Replica's model. So Replica is left-leaning and also is very anti any sort of harmful behavior, unless it's directed toward it, and then it seems to spiral. But yeah, a lot of people were talking about, it was during the election, November 4th last year, or was it November 4th, yeah. But we actually were having people engage in the study. And so it was really interesting to see the political commentary that came from that and the chatbot pushing back for anything that was, for example, like against minorities or not left-leaning or pro-Donald Trump. That was woven into the model, yeah.
I just wanted to point out that maybe there's a question in the chat.
Oh, there's a question in the chat. All right, let's look at it. All right, we have one question in the chat. Following from the last question, any recommendations from this work for company policies? Oh, that's also a loaded question. So for company policies, I mean, thinking about the value and the mission of the company, how is it that you get a model and its outputs and its interactions with users to align with those? Now that is a difficult task. But for company policies, what I would say is if you are considering, for example, using your base models and offering them to users in a companionship way, that it should be fairly restrictive. So not just open-ended, people do what they may, because we are seeing such extreme harms from these and from unregulated use. So if a company's just starting with it, I would be very restrictive. And also talk to psychologists about it. But for system prompts and usage policies, one thing that's really helpful is the sort of friction tool where you initiate a pause between the user and the AI. So if the user, let's say, is engaging in some sort of behavior interaction that is flagging something on the platform side where this is maybe going in a direction that's unhealthy, having friction by having, for example, a text box pop up and say, do you want to continue having this conversation? Is this going in the direction that you want? Something like that helps give people pause and reorient them to avoid things like spiraling. So that's one example of kind of a tool you can use. And then just to get to the next question now, we're like right on time. Oh, okay. Oh, very cool. Similar study in Japan. I will take a look at it. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Any last question? We time or we're out of time?
We're at time, but that was really wonderful.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.